The heat still lingered on the pavement when Haley Carmichael vanished in the Riverside neighborhood of Camden, New Jersey, where red brick row houses lined the banks of the Delaware River. The sweltering summer night draped the city in a thin mist rising from the water, making the yellow streetlights flicker like the weak breath of a creature, warning that something was about to happen. At 9:18 p.m., the grocery store owner, Mr. Ramirez, looked through the glass and saw the 19-year-old girl walking quickly along the sidewalk, her canvas bag swinging under the dim light, heading toward the stretch of trees where the street was unusually quiet. Haley only intended to walk a few blocks home, but her figure disappeared around the corner, and no one ever saw her emerge again. What happened in the less than 60 minutes that followed would haunt Camden for 4 decades and expose a secret the city never saw coming. Before diving deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. Camden, New Jersey, a summer evening in 1983, the moment when the humid heat from the Delaware River seemed to embrace the entire city, making every layer of air heavy and carrying the smell of river water mixed with old exhaust fumes. Thin mist drifted from the water into the streets, settling on the faded signs of small shops along the road. The old yellow lights hanging from the poles flickered constantly, creating intermittent flashes of light that made the shadows between the rows of houses seem to stretch endlessly. It was the kind of night when every sound echoed louder than usual, and every silence lasted a few inexplicable seconds longer. Haley Carmichael, 19 years old, had just finished her shift at Soundwave Records, the record store where she'd been working part-time since the start of summer. She slung her old canvas bag over her shoulder and stepped out through the glass door that reflected her own image blurred in the condensation. Haley walked alone on the familiar street, where every sidewalk brick felt as known as the lines on her palm, yet tonight something made her step slow slightly. The hot wind blew through the torn edges of paper advertisements, making a rustling sound like whispers in the dark. From a nearby alley, the sudden clang of metal hitting the ground rang out, sharp enough that Haley startled and turned around. She saw no one, just thick darkness, but the feeling that someone had just been standing there clung to her like a tiny thorn under her skin. She walked faster. Through the window of a closed pawn shop, Haley briefly caught sight of a figure moving, or maybe it was just the reflection of a passing car. She wasn't sure. At the end of the block, somewhere among the parked cars, a car door slammed shut, the sound sharp and final, standing out in a neighborhood that had almost fallen asleep. The last witness to see Haley was the owner of the small grocery store on the corner of Federal Street. He said Haley walked past the shop, the yellow light making her face look tighter than usual, as if she were focused on something behind her. She seemed a little rushed, he recalled, not running, but definitely not strolling. Haley turned onto the tree-lined stretch, where the streetlights were spottier and dimmer. After that, no one saw her again. The distance from where Haley worked to her house was just a few blocks, less than a 10-minute walk, yet hours passed, then another hour. The door stayed shut, the front steps remained still. The porch light stayed on, a habit of Haley's mother whenever she came home late. Dinner on the table had gone completely cold. The chair Haley sat in every night was untouched, with no sign she had returned, and then left again. The family started calling Haley's friends, co-workers, neighbors, even the store where she worked. No one knew anything. No one had seen her leave Market Street in any direction except the stretch the last witness saw. The silence from every call made the whole Carmichael household feel that something was completely wrong. Haley never lost contact like this. Never. By the time the clock had long passed midnight, when worry had turned into clear fear, the family couldn't wait any longer. They picked up the phone and called the police. Haley Carmichael had vanished in the very neighborhood she walked through every day. When the Camden police arrived at the Carmichael home, the clock was nearing 3 a.m. The air in the living room was thick with a tension anyone could feel the moment they stepped inside. Haley's mother sat on the edge of the chair, still holding the landline phone, while her father stood by the window, staring out at the dark street as if still hoping his daughter's silhouette might appear at any moment. A young officer took notes while the detective on duty, Sergeant Paul Maddox, listened carefully to every word from the family. Haley had no habit of staying out all night, never went incommunicado, had no conflicts with anyone. She had simply disappeared. Maddox knew it was too early to conclude anything, but the unusual signs meant he couldn't treat this as a case of a teenager leaving voluntarily. He asked detailed questions about the uniform Haley was wearing, the bag she carried, her relationships, and the route she usually took home. Everything pointed to one thing: Haley's route was very consistent, almost unchanged for months. So the fact that she hadn't come home was an immediate red flag. About 30 minutes later, 2 patrol cars brought the investigation team to Market Street, where Haley worked, then followed the path she usually walked home. Mist from the Delaware River still hung in the air, making the streetlights blur like streaks of color on the wet pavement. The shuttered shops, closed for hours, created an unnatural stillness. Only the occasional sound of a distant truck broke the quiet. The team stopped in front of Soundwave Records. From there, they followed the sidewalk Haley had walked just hours earlier. This area had little foot traffic at night, which made reconstructing the route even more critical. Maddox crouched down to examine small traces on the pavement, candy wrappers, cigarette butts, faint shoe prints, but nothing stood out clearly. The detective pointed for the officer taking notes to mark the route on the map. Storage grocery shop, Federal Street corner, tree-lined stretch, residential area. At the grocery store, police knocked and woke the owner, Mr. Ramirez, the last person to see Haley. He opened the door apologizing for taking a moment to hear the knocking in the middle of the night, but when he learned why, his face quickly turned serious. He said Haley passed by around the time he was closing the shop. The girl looked a bit rushed, he repeated. Not scared, but focused, like she was aware of something behind her. Maddox asked if he saw anyone following or standing nearby. Ramirez shook his head. I only saw Haley's silhouette in the light, no one else. The team continued to the tree-lined stretch, where Haley was last seen. This was the most notable section: sparse lighting, trees blocking part of the view from the main road, no shops open at that hour, and especially no witnesses living right there. The entire roughly 200-meter stretch was almost swallowed by silence. One officer swept a flashlight along the curb where dirt and decayed leaves formed a thin layer. A few faint indentations, very hard to date, but Maddox still ordered them marked for review. A few steps farther, the streetlight faded completely, leaving only the police flashlights cutting through the mist. This was the blind spot, the stretch no one could see, no cameras, no homes facing directly onto it. If Haley had been stopped, pulled into a car, or forced to turn another way, this was exactly where it could have happened. Maddox stood still for a long time, scanning both sides of the street, one side trees, the other, an old brick wall of an abandoned building. No sounds, no signs of a struggle, just thick darkness that seemed to swallow every movement. He ordered the officers to sweep their flashlights across the roadway too. A few pieces of trash were collected per procedure, though nothing suggested they were connected to Haley. Maddox knew any detail could become important later, but for now, everything pointed to one thing: Haley had vanished in an area with 0 witnesses. Back at the temporary headquarters nearby, Maddox pointed to the map and circled 3 areas: the main route Haley took, the corner where she turned, and the tree-lined stretch, the biggest blind spot. Seal off from here to here, he said, drawing a straight line with a marker. From now on, anything on the ground gets collected. The night in Camden remained thick with mist as the investigation team continued their work. And though they didn't yet know what had happened to Haley Carmichael, one truth was slowly emerging: she hadn't simply wandered off. Something had happened on this short stretch of road, and its traces were still somewhere in the darkness. As the eastern sky began to lighten with a thin layer of gray, Sergeant Maddox's search team expanded the perimeter beyond the neighborhood where Haley was last seen. The silence of early morning made their footsteps echo sharply on the still damp sidewalk. Camden at dawn carried an unusual chill, as if the previous night had held on to something that even daylight couldn't chase away. Maddox assigned small teams to fan out in different directions. One retraced the entire Market Street route, another checked the side alleys branching off Federal Street to the main road. 2 officers were tasked with walking the Delaware riverbank to see if anything had been blown by wind or washed downstream overnight. No one spoke much. The tension from finding no concrete sign of Haley made everyone focus completely on the ground, the walls, every tiny detail. At the corner of an alley, connecting two rows of old houses, one officer bent down to examine a long faint grayish streak on the concrete. It wasn't motor oil, and didn't quite look like a tire skid either. Maddox came over, shining his flashlight at an angle to check the compression on the surface. Could be a slide mark, he said, but didn't confirm whether it was human or something else. It was too faint, too old, or maybe freshly made by something dragged across. No one was sure, but Maddox ordered it marked with white paint for the tech team to process later. Farther in, the team found a small rectangular piece of paper, folded in half and stuck to the curb by the night's dampness. It looked like a torn piece from a shopping bag or receipt, but the ink had run so badly it was illegible. Even though it could just be wind-blown trash, Maddox ordered it bagged and sealed. "We don't know what matters yet," he reminded his team, "so don't dismiss anything just because it's small." Near the metal fence of an abandoned parking lot, another officer called Maddox over to see what he'd found: 3 faint prints in the dirt, as if someone had stood there for a moment before walking away, leaving very light sole impressions. The ground wasn't soft enough for clear shapes, but their position drew attention. They were exactly where the street light didn't reach. A dead zone no one could have seen the night before. Maddox turned and tried to mimic Haley's stance, if she had stood there, then measured the distance to the main road. "Could be a witness, a suspect or nothing," he said. "But the thing is, this spot is hidden enough that no one would be seen." Meanwhile, the riverbank team radioed that they'd found nothing: no purse, no shoes, no jewelry, just some rotten wood and seaweed washed ashore. The park team nearby reported the same: everything clean except an empty soda can and an old handkerchief a few meters apart, seemingly unrelated. Maddox gathered the team back at the starting point, on Federal Street. The first rays of sunlight were up, stretching the shadows of the old buildings across the road. He had them redraw a temporary map of the entire area. Places checked, places not, locations of every faint mark and collected item. Looking at that map, one thing became very clear. Haley's route showed no trace that she had left the area willingly. No personal items, no distinctive footprints, no note, no disturbance. "We're expanding the radius another 3 blocks, Maddox said, his voice low but firm. "From the last witness point, fan out in both directions, every alley, shortcut, parking lot, abandoned building, check them all." Immediately, the officers regrouped. One team east, another north, each instructed to radio directly if anything suspicious turned up, no matter how small. Yet with every report that came back, every residential block swept, every alley lit by flashlight, the result stayed the same: not a single trace leading to Haley Carmichael. No signs of a struggle, no scream anyone remembered, no item clearly hers. It was as if the dark stretch of road the night before had erased everything, leaving a void that made the investigation team so uneasy that Maddox stopped several times to recheck the map, hoping to spot something they'd missed. By mid-morning, when the sun had completely burned off the last of the previous night's mist, Maddox stood in the middle of the tree-lined stretch, looking down the sidewalk. Haley had walked just hours before she disappeared. The morning breeze rustled the leaves lightly. Nothing was different from any other morning in Camden, except for one truth that weighed on everyone. Haley had walked into the darkness here, and every trace stopped exactly where they were standing. They didn't find Haley. They didn't find anything to show where she went. And that very emptiness, more than any mark, was the clearest evidence that something had happened. That afternoon, after the team had finished the first full sweep around Federal Street, and still found no direct trace of Haley, Sergeant Maddox decided to expand the search another 2 blocks. He didn't expect much. Usually the most important evidence is closest to where the victim was last seen, but the absolute emptiness they'd encountered from night through morning gave him a feeling that something didn't add up, and when that feeling hit, Maddox always followed it. A little after 4 p.m., while the Southern search team was rechecking parking lots and backyards between the rows of houses, a young officer named Harris radioed that they had found something possibly related to Haley Carmichael. Maddox immediately told them to freeze the scene, touch nothing, and hurried over. The evidence was found in a small parking lot behind an apartment building, a place not on Haley's daily route home. To reach it, Haley would have had to turn off her usual path 2 more intersections, something every friend and family member insisted she never did. There were no stores or acquaintances there to explain why she might have stopped by. The item discovered was the leather bracelet Haley always wore, the kind with a small metal musical note charm, something her friend said she almost never took off. It was lying right next to the brick wall of the parking lot, just a few centimeters off the ground, as if someone had dropped it or left it on purpose. The location was far from Haley's route, hidden behind 2 turns and a row of trash bins, nowhere she had any reason to be. Maddox stared at the bracelet for a long time without speaking. He asked Harris to repeat who found it. "A man who lives in this building," Harris answered, pointing toward the apartments. "He said he was taking out the trash and saw something glinting on the ground, so he picked it up." Maddox immediately asked to speak to the man. His name was Richard Lowell, about 50 years old, thin build, wearing a wrinkled old shirt and a sleepy expression, as if he'd been woken up in the middle of an afternoon nap. Lowell recounted the story in a flat voice. He was taking out the trash, accidentally spotted something shiny on the ground, bent down to pick it up, and immediately reported it to the officers standing nearby. At first glance, the statement seemed unremarkable, but 2 details caught Maddox's attention. First, when he found the bracelet, Lowell said he wasn't sure it was anything valuable, yet according to neighbors, he was well known for picking up odd items around the neighborhood, and usually kept whatever he found. A guy like that hands a strange object straight to the police without hesitation. That felt off. Second, the area he claimed he went to take out the trash had no dumpsters anywhere near where the bracelet was lying. The building's trash collection area was on the opposite side, more than 10 meters away. "You said you were bringing trash out here?" Maddox repeated. His eyes locked on Lowell. Lowell hesitated for a split second. Yeah, I took a shortcut through here," he answered, his voice no longer as steady as before. "A shortcut to where?" "Well, I just walk around sometimes."
Habit.
There's no law against a resident wandering around a parking lot, but the inconsistency in his story was something Maddox couldn't ignore. He made a note: statement inconsistent, needs follow-up. Once the bracelet was sealed and sent for analysis, Maddox stood in the parking lot for a moment, looking around as if trying to reconstruct something. This location didn't connect to Haley's route home, nor was it near the store where she worked. Haley's bracelet couldn't have just naturally ended up here, and right then, a thought crept into his head. This piece of evidence might not have been dropped here the night Haley disappeared. It might have been placed here later. That suspicion led him to order the search perimeter expanded another full block westward, an area they hadn't originally considered because it was too far from Haley's path. The search team quickly spread out, checking under stoops, shining lights into the cracks between buildings, sweeping along the metal fences around the parking lot. Though they found nothing else directly tied to Haley, they discovered a very faint drag mark on the concrete that ran toward the area near an old dumpster. The mark was too faint to determine what had been dragged or when, but it led toward the spot where the bracelet had been found. Maddox didn't jump to conclusions, but his mind had already crossed off the theory that Haley dropped it herself. Too many things didn't add up, and if someone had moved the bracelet here, that meant they wanted to mislead the investigation, or create the impression Haley had passed through this area. That was the moment, since taking the case, that Sergeant Maddox admitted to himself, this was no longer a routine missing person case. Someone's hand had interfered with Haley Carmichael's story. After the bracelet was collected, and Richard Lowell's odd statement was documented, Sergeant Maddox returned to the temporary headquarters near Federal Street to review everything the team had gathered from the night Haley vanished through that afternoon. On the table lay the map marking Haley's route, the areas already searched, and loose sheets with witness statements. But when he pieced it all together, what jumped out wasn't a clear truth, it was a series of discrepancies that didn't make sense. The first witness, Mr. Ramirez at the grocery store, was certain Haley walked east, straight toward home, because he saw her turn right toward the trees. Yet the very next morning, a woman living in the apartment across the street claimed she saw a girl who looked like Haley walking the opposite direction, toward the busier, more commercial part of the neighborhood. The woman said she noticed because the girl's bag looked really familiar, but Maddox knew identification based only on clothing in poor lighting was highly unreliable. Maddox sent 2 officers back to re-interview the woman. When pressed, she backtracked, "I think that's what I saw, but it could have been someone else. Everything from last night is kind of fuzzy." Her answer rendered the statement nearly worthless, yet it opened the possibility that other people, unknown to the investigation, had been around Haley that night. It wasn't just conflicting directions. A man walking his dog around the time Haley was believed to be passing the tree-lined stretch told police he heard a loud bang, like someone kicked a metal dumpster. The location where he heard it was very close to where the bracelet was later found. When Maddox asked if he saw anyone or any strange lights or movement, the man shook his head, "No, just the sound," then nothing. Notably, he was certain the time was around 9:30 p.m., but when cross-referenced with Ramirez's and the opposite apartment woman's statements, the times were off by more than 20 minutes. No one gave an exact minute, but the window between 9:10 and 9:40 kept coming up, each person with their own version. In a nighttime disappearance, a 20 to 30-minute discrepancy meant Haley's route and location could have been completely different from the initial assumption. A young man living behind the parking lot even claimed he heard running footsteps around nearly 10 p.m., but couldn't say who, in which direction, or whether it had anything to do with Haley. Maddox asked him to describe the sound again, and the kid only said, "It sounded like shoes running on concrete, fast, then it stopped." The detail could mean nothing. Anyone could have been jogging through the neighborhood. But when combined with the faint slide mark and traces on the concrete in the back alley, Maddox realized that at the very least, the sound had occurred in the exact area that mattered. The detective on the team asked the kid a few more questions, but he just repeated that he didn't think it was a big deal, because people sometimes jogged at night around there. Still, nearly 10 p.m. wasn't a typical time for foot traffic in that area, especially young people. Maddox wrote it down and circled, "Possibly related, unconfirmed." Meanwhile, the Vegas statement came from an elderly man living on the second floor of a building near the trees. At first he said he heard nothing but distant cars, but when Maddox asked a second time, he added that he did see a flash of headlights on the empty stretch, then it vanished after a second. When asked why he hadn't mentioned it initially, he replied, "I didn't think it mattered. Cars pass through dark streets all the time." Maddox stayed quiet. A seemingly meaningless detail, a quick flash of headlights then gone, strangely lined up with Haley's bracelet being found in a parking lot, not on her route home. If a vehicle appeared in that area at the exact time Haley vanished, it was no longer a small detail. It could be the start of a chain of events, but no single piece of evidence was conclusive, and every statement pulled in a different direction. The person who heard the metal clang said it was earlier. The one who heard running said later. The one who saw headlights wasn't sure of the time. Even Ramirez, the most reliable witness, admitted he was closing up and didn't check the clock. Maddox knew that to build an accurate timeline, he had to re-interview every witness. He picked up a pen and started a list. Ramirez, the woman across the street, the dog walker, the kid who heard running, the second-floor man. When he finished, he looked at the list and realized one thing: 5 witnesses, 5 stories, 5 different times, and only one truth. He closed the file and tapped the table lightly, as if solidifying his thoughts. "We go back to them," he told the team. "One by one, every word, every minute of that night gets cross-checked. One of these statements is hiding a critical piece." That was when the investigation officially entered the phase Maddox knew would be the hardest, separating truth from falsehood in what witnesses thought they had seen. After reviewing all the conflicting statements from the night Haley disappeared, Sergeant Maddox understood he couldn't rely on the witnesses' patchy memories to track the girl down. To move forward, he needed to know who was in that area, who knew Haley, who had reason to be on the streets near Federal Street on the evening of August 17th. That meant building an initial suspect list, not because there was evidence against anyone yet, but because anyone present nearby might know something they weren't saying. Maddox started with the tightest circle, where Haley worked, Soundwave Records had 3 people on the evening shift during the week, but the night Haley vanished, only one person worked with her, a young man named Kyle Ranford. Kyle said he left the store 10 minutes after Haley and went straight home to his parents' house, where he still lived. His alibi rested solely on his own word, because his parents went to bed early and couldn't confirm what time he got in. Maddox put him on the list. Suspect 1. Next was the grocery store owner, Mr. Ramirez, the last person to see Haley. He showed no obvious red flags, but investigative rules wouldn't let Maddox clear him just because he was cooperative. When asked what he did after closing, Ramirez said he walked home 2 blocks away and watched TV until late. An unverifiable alibi. He became suspect 2. From there, the list grew fast. A woman living across from where Haley was last seen was added, not because she seemed suspicious, but because her statement contradicted Ramirez's own description. She was marked suspect 3, category conflicting witness, needs verification. The team kept canvassing stores, homes and apartments nearby. A plumber named Earl McKinney was added, because he claimed he passed through the Federal Street area that night to grab tools from his truck, but when police asked where his truck was parked, he got flustered and changed his answer twice. McKinney became suspect 4, a young couple who regularly walked their dog in the area was added simply because they were present during part of the timeline. When Haley disappeared, their statements were fairly consistent, but Maddox still listed them as suspects 5 and 6. Next was a homeless man who slept in a nearby abandoned garage, Chester Boone. He seemed cooperative, but his memory was foggy, and his statement about sounds he heard the night Haley vanished was potentially important. Maddox marked him suspect 7, category possible witness, who saw something. Night shift workers at Lockridge Auto, whose shop was not far from where the bracelet was found, were also added. One of them, Dion Keller, said he left at 9:20 to buy cigarettes. The other 2 said he left at 9:40. Maddox didn't like that kind of time discrepancy. Keller became suspect 8. One name that stood out to Maddox was Frank Devlin, owner of a small radio repair shop near Federal Street. Devlin had been near the scene that night, according to a neighboring store's security camera, a detail he never mentioned in his statement. When Maddox asked why, Devlin said he forgot. Devlin became suspect 9. Finally, 2 more names came from residents' tips. A man often seen at night on Federal Street, described as always hanging around, no clear reason, suspect 10, and the young man behind the parking lot, who heard running footsteps, but couldn't give a precise time, suspect 11. When the list of 11 names was complete, Maddox looked at it like a chaotic circle: acquaintances, strangers, people just passing through, people acting shady, all could be lying or simply remembering poorly. No one stood out above the rest, yet no one could be fully ruled out. He began categorizing them into 3 priority levels. Group A: high priority, 3 people, those with unusual behavior, conflicting statements, or extremely close to the scene. Frank Devlin didn't disclose his actual location. Dion Keller, inconsistent departure time from the shop. Earl McKinney, evasive, changed story multiple times. Group B: medium priority, 4 people, present in the area at the right time, but no clear red flags. Kyle Ranford. No one can confirm he went straight home. Ramirez, last confirmed witness, but no proof of his actions afterward. Woman across the street, contradictory statement. Young man who heard running, potentially important info but unclear. Group C, low priority, 4 people, present near the area but no clear motive, or only passing through. Dog walking couple. Chester Boone, homeless witness, who heard sounds but weak memory. The regular lurker on Federal Street, odd behavior, but no direct link. Other Lockridge night shift worker, no contradictions, but in the zone. The list was done, but instead of feeling progress, Maddox felt like he'd just stepped into a maze. Many of these people could be completely innocent, and he didn't want to turn them into community pariahs, just for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Yet one of these names might be the last person to see Haley alive, or worse, the person who made her disappear. Maddox took a slow breath and closed the file. Tomorrow, he told the team, we start bringing them in, one by one. And when he said that, one thing Maddox knew for certain, this messy, ambiguous list of 11 people wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The next day, when Sergeant Maddox's team returned to the scene, with the list of 11 suspects in hand, Camden woke up under a thick blanket of fog that coated every stoop, every sign, every road leading out to the city's edges. And it was precisely those edges, the areas beyond where Haley normally went, that became the investigation's next focus. If Haley had been forced in a different direction, or if someone had wanted to hide traces that very night, Camden's outskirts might hold the answer. The search team fanned out in 3 directions: southwest toward vacant lots and old warehouses, north near sparsely populated residential blocks, and farther east, where the roads led to the riverbank and overpasses Haley never walked alone. They checked every yard, every side alley, every trash area, but everything was exactly like the rest of the case, silent, barren, and revealing nothing. One officer reported finding a small scrap of fabric caught on a metal fence near the old warehouse district, but when Maddox examined it, he knew immediately it was unrelated, just a piece of burlap from a feed sack, common all over the city, nothing distinctive, no strange smell, no sign of recent use. They bagged it anyway, but everyone understood the odds of it being connected to Haley were slim. In the hours that followed, the team walked the edges of old railroad tracks, where kids once played, then a small park where teenagers hung out on weekends. Nothing changed. A chipped brick, a few scraps of wind-blown paper, some old tire marks baked into the dry dirt. None of it said anything. Maddox tried to keep the team's spirits up, but he could feel the exhaustion creeping into every step. That same afternoon, back at the temporary headquarters, an incident made the case even messier. A piece of evidence had been misfiled. It was the scrap of paper found near the curb on the first day of searching, deemed unimportant, but kept per procedure. When the detective in charge tried to send it to the lab, they discovered it was no longer in its original envelope, and had been mixed into the file of an unrelated burglary case from years earlier. The mistake infuriated Maddox, but more importantly, it disrupted the entire workflow. Every piece of evidence now had to be rechecked, to ensure no further errors. That wasn't all. That same afternoon, delivered another blow to the investigation's momentum. Young Detective Shane Collins, the one who had personally collected most of the witness statements, suddenly announced he was leaving the force for personal reasons. Maddox looked at Collins's file, neat handwriting, clear notes, small observations that had helped shape the case's early direction. Losing a member who understood the case structure from the very first hours wasn't just losing manpower, it was losing part of the team's collective memory. And in an investigation, continuous memory is irreplaceable. Collins handed over his files, but any transfer creates gaps. The new person has to read everything from scratch, relearn every witness, every contradiction, every tiny detail Collins had recorded. And that slowed the case down by days Maddox desperately didn't want to lose. In the days that followed, the case felt like it had entered a thick fog that made everything sluggish. None of the people on the suspect list developed significant new inconsistencies. No one contradicted themselves enough to be held for extended questioning. Additional peripheral witnesses all said things that were either unverifiable or completely irrelevant. What bothered Maddox most was the terrifying absence of physical evidence. No shoes, no purse, no papers, no drag marks, no distinctive fabric fibers, no weapon, no blood. For a girl who vanished in the middle of a residential neighborhood, the total lack of traces was highly unusual. Unusual enough that Maddox had to ask himself whether the case was approaching a level of sophistication he hadn't initially imagined. One evening, Maddox stood alone on the stretch where Haley was last seen, watching the long shadows of the trees fall across the ground. The streetlights still flickered exactly as they had that first night, and the houses remained shut tight, as if they no longer wanted to answer any questions. All that was left in his mind was the feeling someone had done something here, and left no trace. Even after the team expanded the search radius another block, then another, the results stayed the same. Reports kept coming back with the same message: nothing, found nothing, no new evidence. And so the case slowly drifted into still waters where everything repeated but nothing moved forward. By the end of the week, Maddox looked at the map covered in red marks, showing every area searched, and realized the team had swept nearly every reasonable zone around the scene. No one was obviously lying. No one displayed specific suspicious behavior, and the only piece of evidence, the bracelet, gave them no clear direction to follow. And right then, he knew the case was entering the phase every investigator dreads: the slowdown, the phase where every lead fades, every question becomes hollow, and time itself starts to feel like the enemy. Camden kept living its daily life, but the Haley Carmichael case did not. It began to stall, as if the city itself was holding something back in the dark that no one could see. From the end of summer 1983 through all of 1984, the Haley Carmichael case remained on the Camden investigation team's active schedule, but as the months passed, the initial urgency was steadily worn away by reports that repeated the same message: no new leads. No witness came forward with valuable new information. None of the 11 suspects developed fresh contradictions, and no physical evidence emerged to help relocate Haley's final steps. Sergeant Maddox and his team clung to what little they had left: the bracelet, the ink-smeared scrap of paper, the faint slide marks on the concrete, the scattered statements about headlights. But no piece was sharp enough to fit into a complete picture. Every time Maddox looked at the timeline board, he saw one huge gap stretching from the last confirmed sighting of Haley to when her family called the police. And that gap was the one thing he couldn't fill. Throughout 1984, the team re-interviewed every suspect. Kyle Ranford, Haley's co-worker, showed no change in his story. Ramirez still insisted he saw no one following Haley. Frank Devlin, the radio repair shop owner, remained defensive but broke no laws. Nothing tied him to the scene. Dion Keller from the auto shop explained the time discrepancy as a mix-up from being tired, and though Maddox didn't fully buy it, he found no evidence to disprove it. The original 11 names gradually faded. Some people moved, some changed jobs, and when detectives tracked them down, they answered with faces that looked almost unfamiliar, as if Haley's story had become a hazy memory even to them. Without evidence to cross-check, police were forced to clear people one by one under the principle of elimination: no motive, no opportunity, or simply no link to the bracelet, the parking lot, or the tree-lined stretch. By the end of 1984, only 2 names remained on the watch list, but still without new physical evidence or statements to move forward. During that period, the department itself changed. Some detectives transferred, some retired, and their replacements lacked the same intimate knowledge Maddox and his original team had built. Meanwhile, the old evidence was pushed further back by time. Evidence handling protocols in the early 80s weren't as rigorous as they later became. Many envelopes were labeled only in handwriting, some missing descriptions, and the scrap of paper found near the curb, already misfiled once, stood as proof of the chaos in the storage system of that era. Haley's bracelet, though kept more carefully, was no longer considered high-value evidence when no biological traces could be analyzed with the technology available then. Heading into 1985, Maddox looked at the case file like a room full of boarded-up windows. He knew something was outside, but there was no longer a way to reach it. At a meeting in the spring of that year, his superiors asked for an update on the Haley Carmichael case. All Maddox could say was the truth: no progress, no new investigative direction, no new witnesses, and no legal basis to keep summoning suspects. That was the meeting where he knew what was coming. A few weeks later, the Haley Carmichael file was officially moved from active investigation to cold case, the category for long-stalled investigations with no progress. The process was far quieter than the victim's family ever imagined. No press conference, no big announcement, just a few stamps, a few signatures, and one file slid into the correct slot in a cold metal cabinet in the Camden Police Department's long-term storage room. Maddox watched the archivist slide the drawer shut, the metallic scrape echoing coldly. He said nothing, but that truth was harder to swallow than any failure in his career. The case of a 19-year-old girl who vanished in the very neighborhood where she grew up had fallen silent. Haley's family still called the station every few weeks, asking if anything was new. The answer was always the same: "We're still monitoring it. We'll contact you if anything comes up." But both they and the department knew those words, however well-intentioned, were just an attempt to keep a flicker of hope alive, while the truth stood still. Time passed the way it always does in unsolved cases, quietly fading witnesses' memories, erasing traces, and pushing the whole thing into the shadows of forgetting. The old evidence sat untouched in storage, notes grew dog-eared, scattered statements went unread. And so in 1985, the disappearance of Haley Carmichael, once a case that had the whole neighborhood on edge, sank completely into the cold case files, as if the city of Camden itself wanted to close this chapter, even though the truth was still out there somewhere, out of reach. Nearly 2 decades passed since the night Haley Carmichael vanished from the corner of Federal Street. For most Camden residents, the case had folded into the creases of urban memory, mentioned occasionally when someone else went missing, then gradually replaced by newer stories, more immediate concerns. But at the Camden Police Department, Haley's file sat untouched in cold storage. No one opened it, no one reviewed it, no one asked further questions. It's hard to believe that a chance clue would surface in 2004, like a gentle knock on the lid of a box no one had touched in years. That spring, Camden experienced unusually heavy rain. Water from the Delaware River rose, seeping into the smaller tributaries that ran through the city, including Newton Creek, a narrow but deep stream that curved around the outskirts and out to the marshy wastelands. After days of torrential downpour, the bank near a bend in the creek eroded and collapsed, exposing soil that had been hidden for years. Environmental workers noticed the landslide and notified the city. Police were dispatched mainly to check whether any homeless people sheltering there might have been injured. During the survey, an officer's flashlight caught a reflection off something tangled in an exposed tree root after the collapse. It was a scrap of fabric, not a full piece of clothing, just a small frayed patch, red faded almost to brown. Beneath the mud, a length of cord appeared, thin nylon rope, old and twisted from once being pulled tight. A short distance away lay a black button, the flat kind used on light jackets or heavy shirts. 3 tiny items, nothing remarkable at first glance, but the way they lay together, swept to the same spot by the flood, made the officer who collected them think they might be connected to something that happened long ago. He immediately brought the evidence to temporary storage, following proper procedure. But that's exactly where everything started to go wrong. The log recorded the items placed in an envelope, sealed and labeled, items recovered from Newton Creek landslide, fabric scrap, cord button, 2004. However, the officer entering the data into the system typed the wrong case code. Instead of unidentified evidence, open, the code entered was 0047B, which matched a long-closed property theft case. No one cross-checked. No one caught the mistake. That single character error sent the evidence straight into a completely unrelated place, the storage section for property crimes, where no one would ever think to look for potential evidence tied to a missing person case. When the Newton Creek investigation team was asked to evaluate the evidence, they only did a cursory review. The fabric scrap was too old to date accurately. The nylon cord was a common type used for everything from household items to camping. The button had no distinctive identifying features, no blood, no hair, no clear traces. Moreover, there were no missing person reports around 2004 that matched the recovered items. The team's conclusion: the evidence had no value in any open cases. What they didn't know, because the wrong case code hid it, was that there was a 1983 disappearance. These items accidentally fit the geographic context of Maddox, who had once led the Haley case, had retired a year earlier. The detective who replaced him had never done a full review of Haley's file. To them, the scraps of fabric, cord and button were just remnants of some object washed ashore. There was no reason for them to connect Newton Creek to Federal Street, 2 locations more than a mile apart, with no obvious travel route between them. The misfiled code turned the evidence into a grain of sand, that fell into the abyss of the storage system. It was never routed to the missing persons or violent crime evidence unit. It was never flagged for further analysis. It was never pulled during periodic reviews. It sank into a cold metal drawer, where harsh fluorescent light shone on hundreds of other sealed envelopes. In an internal 2005 report, the reviewer even wrote clearly, "Newton Creek evidence, no case linkage, store as non-priority." Just 4 words, non-priority, were enough to seal the fate of those items for nearly 2 more decades. They lay untouched in the darkness of storage, unopened, unquestioned, and with each passing year, the chance of ever linking them to any case grew smaller, until it was practically zero. If someone at that time had remembered the Haley Carmichael case, remembered the bracelet found in an odd location, or recalled the statements about a flash of headlights that vanished in the night, they might have asked for the Newton Creek evidence to be re-examined differently, but no one remembered. Haley's case had sunk into the background of Camden's investigative history, quiet, cold and silent. 2004 passed, then 2005, 2006, 2007. Evidence envelopes were stacked, moved to temporary shelves, then consolidated to save space. Every relocation, the wrong code kept it tied to a long-forgotten theft case no one was tracking. The fabric scrap, cord and button became orphaned evidence in a story no one yet knew would matter. And so, a tiny clue, extremely tiny, that had emerged from the earth, thanks to that year's heavy rain, was buried a second time. This time not under the mud of Newton Creek, but beneath paperwork, mistakes, and the indifference of an entire system. It would stay there for nearly another 20 years, waiting for someone patient enough, knowledgeable enough, and determined enough to reopen doors that seemed sealed forever. In 2018, Camden saw a major shift in investigative procedure. The city established the Cold Case Unit, a new team tasked with re-examining decades-old stalled cases. Modern forensic technology, improved data retrieval, and growing public pressure forced the department to reopen files they once thought had no path forward. Among the hundreds of cases was a thin pale yellow folder, labeled 83M142, containing the entire unfinished story of Haley Carmichael. Detective Nora Klein, 43 years old, with nearly 20 years on the job, was assigned to take it on. Many colleagues thought it was just an unsolvable disappearance. Some didn't even remember who Haley Carmichael was, but when Nora opened the file, Haley's photo, with lightly curled hair and an awkward smile in the ID picture, looked straight at her as if pleading. And for Nora, that was enough to make her want to start over from scratch. In the small cold case unit meeting room, Nora began reorganizing the file chronologically. Old 1983 newspaper clippings, describing community panic, blown-up maps of Camden, marked with faded marker, statements typed on typewriters. But what caught her attention wasn't the content, it was how the file had been put together. From the very first pages, Nora noticed inconsistencies, handwritten notes inserted between typed sections, odd blank spaces where something appeared to have been written and then erased, statement times that didn't match the described events. For example, Mr. Ramirez's statement, "The last person to see Haley," listed the time as 9:20 p.m., but on the route diagram, the spot where he was standing was marked as 9:35 p.m. No one had corrected the map, no note explained the discrepancy. Another statement from the young man who heard running footsteps said 10 p.m., yet the log showed he called police at 9:52 p.m. Those small gaps might be overlooked in a quickly solved case, but in a 35-year-old unsolved disappearance, every minute was worth gold. Nora kept flipping pages and found something that made her frown. Many spots had been erased with correction fluid, thinning the paper and making it glow under the light. What had been erased no one knew: times, names, locations, or just clerical fixes. No one left at the cold case unit had the authority or memory to confirm. All Nora knew was that the 1983 leadership was gone, some deceased, others with no recollection of details. She set the erased pages aside and pulled out the large-scale field diagram of the case. Looking at it, Nora noticed something prior investigators might have missed. Haley's route that night hadn't been reconstructed based on the actual positions of stores and streetlights. The diagram placed the grocery store slightly too far left, throwing the travel direction off by several meters. It seemed minor, but in disappearances, a single meter can mean the difference between walking in the light or stepping into a blind spot no one could see. In the file was also a quick handwritten note in blue ink. Check West warehouses, but no report showed that lead had ever been followed. When Nora asked what the West warehouses were, a veteran officer, who had worked the 80s, said it might refer to the parking lot where Haley's bracelet was found. But the note was stuck between two unrelated pages, as if someone wrote it and forgot to follow up. What caught Nora's attention most was a line in the investigation report: no related evidence collected in outlying areas. She knew that couldn't be true, because in 2004 Newton Creek had yielded items after a landslide. When Nora asked storage for those items, the archivist took nearly an hour to locate the envelope, and it turned out to be filed in the 1996 property theft section, completely unrelated. Nora frowned. "Why is it in here?" The archivist shook his head. "Wrong case code probably. Been sitting here for years. Wrong case code. Never linked to Haley. Never analyzed. Never connected." She carefully opened the envelope. The faded fabric scrap, the twisted nylon cord, the black button. 3 old items lay quietly as if waiting to be asked about. But what sent a chill down Nora's spine wasn't the items themselves. It was the fact they had been in the wrong drawer for nearly 20 years, and no one had noticed. Back at her desk, Nora wrote a big question in her notebook and underlined it 3 times. What was missed in 1983? She didn't know the answer yet, but she knew where to start looking. The erased sections, the mismatched statements, the notes no one followed up on, and the evidence filed in the wrong place. And above all, she felt like the case was gently opening its eyes again, after a long sleep no one thought it would ever wake from. Having worked long cold cases before, Nora Klein understood one thing: before finding new answers, you have to be sure you didn't miss the old ones. The Haley Carmichael case was no longer just a stack of yellowed papers. It was a timeline stretching from 1983 to 2018, full of gaps. To fill them, Nora had to start with the most basic step: building a forensic timeline. She spread a map of Camden across the table, this time not a blurry 1980s photocopy, but a freshly printed digital map that could measure exact distances to the meter. Next to it was the witness list: times, locations, who said what. Nora used different colored markers for each witness. Haley left the store around 9 p.m. Ramirez said he saw her turn onto the tree-lined stretch around 9:20. The kid who heard running said almost 10 o'clock. The dog walker heard the metal clang around 9:30. Everyone had a number, and every number was suspiciously imprecise. Using software, Nora measured the distance from Soundwave Records to Ramirez's grocery store, then from there to the tree-lined stretch. A normal walking pace takes about 7-8 minutes. If Haley left the store at exactly 9 o'clock, she would reach the grocery around 9:07, 9:10. So Ramirez's 9:20 was roughly 10 minutes late. Nora didn't think he was deliberately lying. Human memory is rarely accurate to the minute, but it showed every time marker had drifted somewhat. She noted, witness times equal sign estimates, not absolute. Don't cling too tightly to minutes. However, when she moved to some of the Group A suspects, Nora started seeing discrepancies that couldn't be explained away by foggy memory. First was Dion Keller, the Lockridge Auto night shift worker. In the 1983 file, Keller said he left the shop at 9:20 p.m. to buy cigarettes at a store a few blocks away. But when Nora looked up the address he mentioned, she discovered it was nearly a mile and a half from the shop. Even a fast walker needs at least 20 minutes each way. If Keller left at 9:20, he couldn't have walked there, bought cigarettes, and been back by 10 o'clock as he once claimed. Nora drew a red circle around his name on the board. Alibi incompatible with actual distance. She then checked the shift log from that night. 2 of Keller's co-workers said they remember him still being there close to closing around 9:40. Back then police wrote it off as time confusion, but with a forensic timeline, Nora saw, either Keller left at 9:20 to buy cigarettes, and no one saw him at 9:40, or he was at the shop until 9:40, and made up the cigarette run. Both couldn't be true. Next was Frank Devlin, the radio repair shop owner. Devlin had told police he stayed home all evening, watched TV and dozed off. Yet Nora found in the old file a printout from a neighboring shop's security camera. Something in 1983, they only glanced at and filed away, never enlarged or compared like they could now. The grainy stills showed a tall man, slightly stooped, wearing a baseball cap, near the back parking lot, time stamped around 9:45 p.m. based on the camera's clock. Comparing it to current photos of Devlin, Nora couldn't say 100% it was him. The image quality was terrible, but the basic build, gait, even the jacket style matched reasonably well. More importantly, the time he appeared coincided exactly with the window when Haley's trail went completely cold. "You said you were home all night," Nora muttered, staring at the old note, ELB, home alone. "But you show up near the parking lot right when we need to know who was there." She marked next to Devlin's name, contradiction between statement and location evidence. While Nora dug back into the core statements, a name that had seemed minor suddenly resurfaced, Chester Boone, the homeless man who slept in the abandoned garage. In the old file, his statement was recorded very briefly, heard running footsteps and something drop. No follow-up questions, no location diagram, no exact time. Nora decided to take another look. She used the new map and marked the location of the abandoned garage where Boone usually slept, just 2 blocks from the tree-lined stretch, with a direct alley connecting them. If Boone was lying in the garage with the door cracked open, he could absolutely have heard hurried footsteps on concrete, especially on a quiet night, like the one Haley vanished. In the old file, he said he heard the sounds a while after seeing the streetlight flicker. Nora reopened the section describing lighting conditions that night, recalling that many witnesses mentioned the lights in that area often flickered. She underlined one line, flickering light, running footsteps, possible drag mark. What startled Nora was when she cross-referenced the garage location with where Haley's bracelet was found, and the faint slide mark on the concrete. They all lay almost perfectly in a straight line. If someone dragged or shoved Haley, or something heavy, through that area, the frantic footsteps and the sound of something hitting the ground could exactly match what Boone heard. A statement that seemed meaningless in 1983 suddenly fit chillingly with what the map and evidence revealed. Overlooked witness has details matching forensics. Nora quickly jotted in her notebook. Boone was no longer a name on the edge of the list. He became the link connecting sound, location, and ground traces. When she finished the forensic timeline, Nora saw a completely different picture from what the old reports had described. Many suspect movements didn't match real-world geography, distances didn't line up with times, sightlines didn't match vantage points. One witness said they saw Haley walking left to right, but the diagram showed that if she walked that way, she would have been heading toward the main street, not the tree-lined stretch. One suspect said he was just walking around the block, but the route he described was actually over a mile, enough to place him at the parking lot where the bracelet was found. Nora began regrouping everyone on the board. People previously labeled low priority were now pushed higher because their timelines were impossible. Conversely, some who had been suspected based on gut feeling were gradually cleared because their movements perfectly matched time and location. And then, among the mess of dots on the map, a clear red line emerged from Soundwave Records, past Ramirez's grocery store, to the tree-lined stretch, then curving behind, toward the parking lot where the bracelet lay alone, and farther still toward Newton Creek. No one in 1983 had connected those points, but now, with digital maps and distances calculated precisely, that route no longer looked random. "We've been looking in the wrong direction from the start," Nora thought to herself. These were no longer the perfunctory notes of a long-dead case. For the first time in over 30 years, the Haley Carmichael file was seriously shifting direction. In the fall of 2024, Camden was undergoing major infrastructure upgrades. Construction crews were deployed across the city to overhaul the sewer system, replace old pipes, and widen roads. For residents, it was an annoyance: trucks, excavators, and the constant sound of drilling from dawn until late at night. But for the cold case unit, this disruption accidentally became the breakthrough they hadn't found in decades. On the morning of October 14th, a crew digging to replace old pipes near the edge of Pennsauken Township, less than 5 miles from Camden, hit something unusually hard with their excavator. At first they thought it was rock or a chunk of concrete from old construction, but when they scooped away a thin layer of dirt, the operator stopped the machine immediately. It wasn't rock, it was bone. A young worker climbed down and gently brushed off the mud. The ivory-white color became clearer. He stood silent for a few seconds, squinting to be sure he wasn't mistaken. Then he said just one short, dry sentence, like the wind: "Call the police." How long had the remains been there? When the Pennsauken police arrived, they sealed the area immediately. The skeleton lay in a pit nearly a meter deep, mixed with tree roots and collapsed soil. No intact clothing, only a few small shredded scraps of fabric clinging to the limbs. A thin cord was wrapped around the wrist bones, and the back of the skull had a deep indentation, evidence of a single powerful blow with a blunt object, enough to cause instant death. But what caught the forensic team's attention most was the condition of the bones. Forensic specialist Susan Price arrived at the scene that afternoon, crouched down to examine each joint, using tweezers to clear tiny bits of dirt. She stood up, removed her gloves, looked at the scene commander, and said, "Female. Age approximately 18 to 22 at time of death. Died in the early 1980s. The air went completely still. Early 1980s. Young female. Signs of restraint. Severe skull trauma. Dumped in a remote area." The picture matched far too closely the case Camden had failed to solve for over 3 decades. News reaches the cold case unit. Detective Nora Klein's phone rang at 3:17. On the other end was Sergeant Miller from Pennsauken. "We just recovered female remains. Age fits. Time of death fits. Location, fairly close to a plausible route for the Carmichael case." Nora stood up instantly, her chair still spinning. "Send the coordinates. I'm on my way." When Nora arrived, the sight sent a chill down her spine. Not because of the skeleton itself, she had seen that dozens of times in her career, but because it felt like a door had just swung open right in front of her. A door that had been locked for 39 years. She stood at the edge of the pit, looking down at the cracked rear of the skull. One blow from behind, deliberate force. Not a fall, not an accident. She cupped a hand over her mouth and breathed slowly. "This could be her," she said very softly, just loud enough for the colleague beside her to hear. Forensic analysis. The truth in the bones. The skeleton was transported to the lab under special preservation conditions. Susan Price and her team began the work, cleaning the bones, taking x-rays, measuring every vertebra. Preliminary results. For sex. Female feces, approximately 18-22, height, when alive, approximately 5'4" inches, 5'6" inches. Time of death, based on decomposition, early to mid-1980s. Cause of death, blunt force skull trauma. Restraint marks, cord wrapped around wrists, worn into the bone. Indicates binding, while still alive, or immediately after death. Body relocation, inconsistent soil adhesion. Body was moved to disposal site. Nora looked at the results board and couldn't deny it. Every detail matched what she had suspected in the Haley Carmichael file. Haley disappeared in 1983. Haley was 1983. Haley was about 5'5". Haley was believed to have been taken by force, and here was the skeleton of a young woman who died in that exact time frame, not in Camden, but in Pennsauken, just a few miles away. The questions returned the next day. Nora returned to the scene with the terrain analysis team. They reconstructed every possible way the body could have been brought there. Waterways, topography, the quiet roads of the 1980s. What stood out in 1983? This area was almost completely deserted. No housing developments, no major roads, just a few old warehouses and dirt tracks for trucks. If someone wanted to dispose of a body without being seen, this was the perfect place. One officer asked, "Could the body have been carried here by water?" Nora shook her head. "No. Newton Creek doesn't flow here. To get here, someone had to bring her. Then she fell silent for a long time, staring at the line of trees along the road. 39 years. And finally, they had found what Camden had stopped daring to hope for: physical evidence of Haley Carmichael, or at the very least, a very high probability of it. Case reclassified as homicide. In the morning briefing the next day, Nora presented all the forensic results, the overlay maps, the timeline, and the probable connection to the 1983 disappearance. When she mentioned the cord marks on the wrist bones, the entire room fell silent. At the end of her report, she concluded, the Carmichael case needs to be moved from missing persons to homicide investigation. No one objected. No one needed more evidence. The forensic facts spoke for themselves, and so, after nearly 4 decades, the Haley Carmichael file was officially reopened. This time not as a hopeless disappearance, but as an unsolved murder. Nora placed the old folder and the new report side by side, one side yellowed paper, the other modern forensic findings. 2 generations of investigation, separated by decades, finally meeting at the point where history should have stopped from the beginning. Haley didn't just vanish, she was killed, and someone out there had lived 39 years without ever being caught. The case, once thought dissolved by time, opened its eyes once more and looked toward the questions left forgotten for nearly 40 years. How did Haley die? Who brought her here? And what really happened that night in Camden? DNA. The next step. Once the remains were identified as those of a young woman who died in the early 1980s, Nora knew the next step had to be DNA. Not the basic testing of the 1990s or 2000s, but forensic-grade genome sequencing, technology capable of extracting information from old, fragmented bones, even after time had worn away nearly all biological traces. The victim's femur was chosen as the primary sample, since the marrow inside is the part most likely to preserve DNA the longest. The lab, collaborating with the Camden Police Department, a facility specializing in genetic sequencing for cold cases, received the sample and began the complex weeks-long process. The bone had to be micro-cleaned, ground down, then put through dozens of chemical steps to filter out whatever DNA fragments remained. In the early days, Nora didn't dare hope for much. The remains had lain underground for over 30 years, exposed to rain and natural decay. The chances of obtaining a complete DNA profile were slim. But then, one late November afternoon, the lab sent an email, successfully extracted a genome of sufficient quality to build a genetic profile. Nora read the line 3 times, the first to comprehend it, the second to believe it, the third to feel that the Haley Carmichael case, for the first time in 4 decades, was truly alive with hope. Connecting the bloodline. Once the DNA profile was complete, the lab uploaded the data to GDD Match Pro, the investigative genetic genealogy database, where experts can search for distant relatives through matching DNA segments. This isn't a direct relative search. It doesn't look for Haley Carmichael by name. It looks for people who share enough of the genome to prove a blood connection. After 3 days of scanning, GD Match Pro returned preliminary results, several distant matches, but one standout, a first cousin once removed match. Nora stared at the displayed name, Carmichael. Her heart raced. Carmichael is not a common surname, and if someone named Carmichael shared that close a genetic link with the victim, it was almost certain the person in that grave was Haley Carmichael. She immediately contacted the surviving family members. Haley's 2 younger siblings fell silent for a long time when they heard. Then one of them, now nearly 60, said through tears, "We always knew, or at least we always felt it. Send the samples, do whatever needs to be done." Within 48 hours, the lab received DNA samples from the Carmichael family's hair and cheek swabs. The next 10 days of analysis felt like a year, but on December 17, 2024, the final result landed on Nora's desk: 99.998% match. Remains are Haley Carmichael. Nora sat motionless. She had cracked tough cases before, witnessed many breakthrough moments, but this was the first time she felt nearly 40 years of the past come rushing back like a violent storm, tearing away the dust that had settled over a name many thought had been forgotten. Haley Carmichael was no longer missing. Haley Carmichael had been found, but that comfort carried a darker shadow. If Haley was murdered, who did it, And were they still out there? Foreign DNA. Not just one man with the victim's identity confirmed, the lab continued analyzing the items recovered from the grave, the torn scraps of fabric, the nylon cord used to bind the wrists, a button, and some soil samples clinging to the bones. Though heavily degraded, microscopic skin cells could still be isolated using advanced techniques. One evening in January 2025, Nora received a call from Susan Price, the lead forensic examiner. "Nora, we have new results. You'd better come to the lab." When Nora walked in, Susan placed a 10-page report in front of her, but one glance at the summary table told Nora why Susan wanted her there in person. On the binding cord, DNA from one male. On the fabric scrap, DNA from a different male. Two completely distinct profiles. Nora frowned, rereading every line. Profile A, DNA markers consistent with a first male source. Profile B, source from a second, unrelated male. And most importantly, neither profile matched anyone in CODIS. "Are you telling me at least two men had contact with Haley Carmichael's body?" Nora asked. Susan nodded. "Yes, one left DNA on the cord. Another left DNA on the fabric. It can't be the same person. No mistake possible. Could one of them be environmental contamination? No. The sample on the cord is close contact DNA. Fairly strong. Not accidental. The fabric sample is weaker, but still direct person-to-person contact." Nora was quiet for a few seconds. "That means, this wasn't just one perpetrator." Susan placed her hand on the table. "Nora, I think we have to face the possibility Haley was restrained by more than one person. From one shadow to many back in 1983, every investigative path had revolved around the idea of a lone stranger or one of the original suspects seizing an opportunity that night. But with two separate male DNA profiles, the entire old theory collapsed. If only one person attacked Haley, why was there DNA from a second man? If there were two, did they know each other, or were they strangers who happened to cross paths in a crime? If only one killed Haley, what was the other's role, and why had neither appeared in any DNA database for 4 decades? Nora looked again at the 1983 list of 11 suspects, but a new question emerged. Among those men, or the ones who were missed, how many might have done this together? The case had once been seen as simple: a girl vanishes at night, then became a murder, and now, it had turned into a case with at least 2 potential perpetrators. 2 DNA profiles opened 2 completely separate investigative paths, no longer a single name to focus on, no longer a simple timeline. Instead, 2 men, 2 stories, 1 victim, and a mystery no one had ever considered in 40 years. Nora held the 2 DNA reports up to the cold white light of the lab. 2 different genetic sequences, no names, no faces, no past, just 2 shadows who had no idea they had left traces on cord and fabric that the old era couldn't read. But this era could, and for the first time in her career, Nora felt the Haley Carmichael case was no longer just a story from the past. It was waking up. It was telling them the truth wasn't a single straight cut. It was a web, and in that web, there was more than one spider. Case reclassified as homicide continued. When the DNA results confirmed the remains were Haley Carmichael's, and traces from 2 separate men were found on the binding cord and fabric scrap, Nora understood that the next step wasn't just identifying the perpetrators. It was filling in Haley's final hours, a task that seemed nearly impossible after 40 years. But forensic reconstruction, the technique of recreating cause of death and circumstances from silent bones, can sometimes bring a dead moment back to life. The skeleton was laid out on a gleaming silver metal table. Forensic pathologist Susan Price held up a 3D printed model of the skull reconstructed from CT scans, and pointed to the back, a depression the size of half a hand, with jagged cracks radiating from the edges. This, she said, was the first blow, and almost certainly the fatal one. Nora stood beside her, trying to memorize every detail. Force from behind, Susan continued, with a blunt object, most likely a wooden club, metal pipe, or something long with a rounded cross-section. Not a rock, not something sharp. This was deliberate, powerful, and aimed straight at the most vulnerable spot. Nora stared at the simulation. Even though it was just bone, she could almost see the moment. Haley never saw the blow coming. Haley never had time to run, never had time to scream, never had time to turn around. She was attacked from behind, Nora said. Exactly. Susan nodded. And this fracture pattern can't be from a fall. This was intentional. Sings of restraint, a match too perfect to ignore. Next came the wrist bones. Susan held the radius, and ulna up to the light. Tiny grooves were worn into the bone, shallow, but distinct. Binding marks, she said. Thin cord, but tied tightly, while the body was still alive, or immediately after the heart stopped. Another specialist compared these grooves to the evidence recovered from Newton Creek in 2004, the length of cord buried in storage for 2 decades, fiber structure, twist pattern, nylon-cotton blend, thickness. I want you to look closely, Susan said, pulling up magnified images on the screen. The wear on the bone and the twist in the cord fibers, they match perfectly. Nora said nothing. In her mind was the image of the 2004 cord, misfiled evidence once thought useless, now rising like a loud knock on the door of truth. So, Nora said slowly, the cord found in Newton Creek is the same one used to bind Haley in 1983. Very high probability, Susan agreed. Forensically, this match is too specific to be coincidence. A forgotten piece of evidence, a scrap of cord no one paid attention to. It had sat in a drawer for 20 years waiting for the right moment. Body movement, disposal after death. When examining the leg bones, Susan noted very faint scratches on the knees and shins. These, she said, occurred post-mortem, or when she was already unconscious. These aren't drag marks from someone still struggling. You mean the body was moved? Nora asked. Yes, dragged, carried, or slid off a surface. The low level of abrasion suggests it wasn't far, but it wasn't at the spot where she was struck. This meant the place Haley was attacked and the place she was dumped were not the same. Nora turned back to the map. She marked the points. Haley's disappearance location, Federal Street, Camden. Remains recovery site, Pennsauken Township. Distance, nearly 5 miles. She overlaid the 1980s road map, before modern infrastructure expansion. The route from Camden to Pennsauken back then was quiet, mostly industrial roads, warehouses, empty lots, very few lights. Haley didn't get here on her own, Nora said. No, Susan confirmed. Someone drove her here. The body was placed in a shallow pit, no signs of professional burial, just quick disposal. Nora pictured it, a vehicle, 2 men, a victim already unconscious, or dead, a deserted area, all forming one scenario. Haley wasn't held in Camden. She was taken out of the city, to Pennsauken, within hours of being seized. Why Pennsauken? The next question consumed Nora for days. Why choose Pennsauken as the dump site? She pulled up 1983 topographical maps. The area had small warehouses, dirt roads leading to sparse woods, no streetlights. Perfect for disposal, but perfect wasn't random. Whoever chose it knew the area, knew the nighttime routes, knew when no traffic passed. To be honest, Susan said in a meeting, only someone familiar with the terrain could bring a body here without being noticed. Familiar with the terrain, Nora repeated. Pennsauken in 1983 wasn't well traveled, not crowded, not near major residential areas. So who? Someone who lived nearby, someone who worked in the warehouses, a driver familiar with industrial routes, or 1, or 2, people who regularly traveled between Camden and Pennsauken late at night. Nora's thoughts returned to the old suspect list. Dion Keller, night shift auto shop worker, often took quiet routes. Frank Devlin, radio repair shop, near the industrial zone. The man who always hung around, Federal Street, residence unknown. McKinney, plumber, job took him between warehouse districts. Every one of them could have known the old road to Pennsauken. Reconstructing that night, Nora stood in front of the large board and began slotting the forensic pieces into the timeline. She had painstakingly rebuilt. Haley leaves work around 9 p.m. Someone follows her, or approaches her on the tree-lined stretch, she is struck from behind with a blunt object. Explains why no screams were reported. Wrists bound with the exact cord type found in 2004. Body placed in a vehicle. No blood at the scene. Moved immediately after the attack. Likely route, out of Camden, via old industrial roads. Disposal in Pensauken, a remote spot no one would notice. She looked slowly at each piece of information, each matching detail. Everything pointed to one thing: the perpetrators didn't choose the dump site randomly. They knew this place. They had been here before. They knew the way. When Nora said this in the briefing with the unit chief, he only nodded and replied, "We're no longer looking for one person. We're looking for people who knew Pensauken like the back of their own yard." The shadow takes shape now. After nearly 40 years, the truth was beginning to take form. Haley was ambushed. Bound with a cord now forensically confirmed. Taken out of Camden. Dumped in a place only someone familiar with the terrain would find. And most crucially, more than one perpetrator. Nora looked once more at the 3D image of Haley's skull, a blow to the back of the head, a cord wrapped tight around the wrists. One final journey of a few miles from Camden to Pensauken. Did Haley know them? Nora asked herself, and who knew the road that led her here? The case was no longer an undefined shadow. It had structure, it had direction, it had locations, it had behavior, and it had a weapon, still missing, but described clearly enough by forensics to trace. Haley had been silent for 40 years, but through bone, through cord, through cracks, she was speaking, and Nora understood. This was only the beginning of the truth. After reconstructing Haley Carmichael's cause of death, and confirming she was removed from Camden before being dumped in Pensauken, Nora knew the next steps were no longer in the forensic lab. They were in personnel files, route maps, time cards, tax records, employment documents, decades of digitized public data. Things that in 1983 did not exist in easily searchable form. If forensics told Nora how Haley died, then digitized data, what modern technology could now resurrect, would tell her who might have done it. Digitalize, tracing 1983 footsteps in 2024. For years, the original 11 suspects were considered unverifiable due to lack of objective data. But that was a 1983 problem. This is 2024. Public data mines, tax records, address registries, utility bills, employment files have all been digitized. Nora opened the old list of 11 suspects. She began tying each one to 3 key factors. 1. Timeline on the night of August 17, 1983 when Haley vanished. 2. Ability to reach Pensauken within the window of death. 3. Access to the forensically confirmed cord type. Nora asked a data specialist to build an automated timeline, input their home addresses, workplaces, distances, and travel times from Camden to Pensauken, using 1983 archived road maps. The initial results left the briefing room silent. 8 of the 11 suspects could not have been in Pensauken the night Haley died, not because they had ironclad alibis, but because some had no vehicle, some were proven by work records to be on night shifts far from Camden, some had no connection to the Pensauken industrial area, which required local knowledge. Some had already left Camden before Haley disappeared. Things the 1983 police couldn't verify were now crystal clear after a few database queries. The suspect list shrank to just 3. Suspect 1. Dion Keller. The exposed lie. Dion Keller, Lockridge Auto night shift worker, claimed in 1983 he left the shop at 9:20 p.m. to buy cigarettes, and was back before 10 o'clock. Digital analysis revealed the only 24-hour cigarette store in the area was 1.5 miles away, not a few blocks as he stated. Real walking time 22 minutes each way. Drive from the shop to the Pensauken dump site on 1983 roads at night, 14 minutes with light traffic. The forensic timeline showed, if Keller left at 9:20 as he claimed, he could easily have reached the disposal site within Haley's time of death. The biggest issue, his co-workers' misremembered times actually aligned with Haley's disappearance window. In 1983, police chalked it up to memory error. In 2024, Nora saw something else: vague statements, 9 convincing reason for leaving, access to a vehicle, familiar with industrial routes. Dion Keller was marked, high suspicion. Suspect 2, Frank Devlin, caught where he denied being Frank Devlin. Radio repair shop owner near Federal Street said, "I was home alone all evening." But the 1983 security camera footage, too grainy to use back then, when enhanced with 2024 AI, revealed a man matching Devlin's height, gait and jacket style appeared near the back parking lot at 9:45 p.m. Devlin never explained why he was there. Nora pulled Devlin's address records from 1982, 1986. He had lived for 3 years in Pennsauken, less than a mile from the disposal site, before moving to Camden. Not just familiar with Camden, he knew the exact area where Haley's body was dumped. Additionally, old payroll stubs showed Devlin once did part-time delivery work for an industrial warehouse. Route passed right through the disposal zone. When Nora laid the evidence out in the briefing, only one sentence was spoken: Devlin knew that place, and very few people did. Suspect 3, Earl McKinney. The unverifiable schedule Earl McKinney, plumber, was the least prominent on the original list, but the forensic timeline showed he owned his own van in 1983. His job regularly took him to Pennsauken warehouse districts. His statement, "I passed Federal Street to get tools from my truck," didn't match where his vehicle was logged in internal registration records. No one could confirm his whereabouts after 9:15 p.m. Most telling, there was zero digital footprint proving McKinney was anywhere else during Haley's abduction and attack. What elevated McKinney: 1. Had a vehicle. 2. Access to nylon cord used in plumbing, matches the forensic cord. 3. Knew the Camden-Pennsauken industrial route. 4. Timeline too smooth, signs of a rehearsed statement. When Nora presented this, the team agreed McKinney was no longer the low-priority suspect of 1983, eliminating 8 suspects. Those cleared weren't proven completely innocent, but the forensic timeline ruled them out entirely. 2 were documented on night shifts far from Camden. A couple's utility and TV usage records confirmed they were home 9:10 p.m. 2 auto shop workers had no vehicles and solid matching alibis. Homeless man Boone was in Camden that night, but forensics proved he never left the area. Couldn't move a body to Pennsauken. The regular lurker was confirmed via hospital records as physically unable to drive. One by one they fell away like old leaves from a tree about to change seasons. Only 3 major branches remained, 3 men who could know what happened, from a broad list, a sharpened investigation. In the final meeting of the month, Nora placed 3 folders in the center of the table: Dion Keller Frank, Devlin Earl McKinney. She wrote on the board 3 factors: ability to access Haley that night, ability to drive to Pennsauken within the death window, access to the confirmed forensic cord type. All 3 matched all 3 factors, but when the DNA profiles were overlaid, Nora realized the most critical point: all 3 could be part of a multi-perpetrator group, no longer one shadow in the night. 3 names, 3 stories, 3 possibilities. Nora looked at the analysis board, then at Haley's 1983 photo, young smile, slightly shy, as if unaware of the horror waiting. "It's time," Nora said, "to move from analysis to confrontation. 3 suspects, 2 DNA traces, 1 victim." The Haley Carmichael case, after 40 years of darkness, had finally narrowed to 3 names that could no longer escape forensics and time. And now, the real hunt was just beginning. 3 suspects narrowed down, forensic timeline clearer than ever. But Nora knew one crucial piece was still missing: someone who had seen or heard something. Yet in 1983, no one treated his statement as important. That person was Chester Boone, the homeless man who used to sleep in the abandoned garage near the tree-lined stretch where Haley was last seen. Boone was now old, his hair almost completely white, living in a city-assisted care facility. When Nora and another officer tracked him down, it took him several minutes to recall the case they mentioned. But as the memories slowly returned, his face changed, as if a rusty old door in his mind had creaked open after decades. That night, Boone said, his gaze drifting, "It wasn't just running I heard. The cops back then thought I was drunk, so nobody asked any follow-up questions." Nora sat down and turned on the recorder. "Just tell us whatever you remember, in your own words." Boone nodded, his hands trembling slightly. "That night, I was lying near the garage door, not far from the street. I heard running footsteps first, uneven, like someone being dragged or shoved. Then I heard metal hit the ground hard." Nora tilted her head. "Are you sure it was metal?" "Sure." Sharp clang, like iron or a steel pipe hitting concrete. Nora glanced at the officer with her. The metal sound had never been taken seriously in 1983, but the 2024 forensics on Haley's skull showed a powerful blunt force injury, possibly from the exact kind of metal object Boone described. "Did you hear any screaming?" Nora asked. Boone shook his head sadly. "No, just heavy breathing, then silence. Terrifying silence." He paused a few seconds, as if fighting the memory. "I told the police back then, but they just wrote a couple lines. They didn't like dealing with homeless people." Nora kept her composure. "You said you heard running. Did you see anyone?" Boone closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "Yes, I saw two shadows, not one." The small room went dead quiet. "Two men," Boone said very slowly. "One tall, walked a little stooped, the other shorter, quicker steps." A chill ran down Nora's spine. The description matched, terrifyingly well, the forensic timeline, pointing to Devlin tall, slightly stooped, and Keller shorter, faster stride. "You said two men. Did you see what they were doing?" "Not clearly," Boone said. "I just saw them cross through the dim light, like they were dragging something, or holding someone up. I'm not sure, but for a moment, I saw someone's feet weren't touching the ground, like they were being lifted." Nora gripped the edge of her chair. "Feet off the ground." Haley was unconscious, or already dead when carried away. Forensic marks on the bones showed she was dragged post-mortem. Boone had just confirmed it with memory. "Do you remember which direction they went?" Nora asked. Boone nodded, toward the road that led to the old St. Marin church. The church was still there back then, the area dark, hardly anyone around. Nora pulled up the 1983 Camden map on her tablet. Sure enough, St. Marin Church sat near the road, leading to the industrial zone. The exact route forensics concluded. Haley was taken out of the city. Boone continued. "They disappeared into the darkness. Then a few minutes later, I heard something like a car door closing. Heavy, loud." Nora felt goosebumps rise on her arms. A vehicle. Two men, a victim being dragged. Direction matching the forensic route. Everything was starting to click together like gears in a machine, left forgotten for 40 years. First conclusion after 4 decades. Not one killer, but two. When Boone finished his statement, Nora turned off the recorder and sat still for a few seconds. For months, the DNA had said two men had contact with Haley, but DNA only speaks in data, not images or memories. Boone had just provided behavioral identification, two figures, moving together, handling a body, using a metal blunt object, leaving in a vehicle. Everything pointed to accomplices, not a lone perpetrator as 1983 police had assumed. "Mr. Boone," Nora said softly, "do you realize how important your statement is today?" He gave a sad smile. "I just told what I saw. Wish they'd asked me more back then." Nora didn't reply, but her heart ached. How many years had the truth been buried, simply because a witness wasn't believed, or because the police back then were too quick to dismiss what they saw as vague? Expanding the investigation, St. Marin Church area. As soon as she left the facility, Nora went straight to the briefing room. On the whiteboard, she drew the route Boone described: Federal Street Alley, St. Marin Church, Industrial Road, Pennsauken. An officer asked, "St. Marin Church, was it even active in 1983? Nora nodded, but the surrounding area was deserted. There was even an old storage shed behind the church. If Haley was moved from Camden to Pennsauken in a few hours, the abductors might have stopped there first. For what? To bind her. to knock her out, to shift her from a living person to something to be disposed of. Nora's voice caught, but she kept presenting. She ordered the team to pull employment records of anyone who worked at the church grounds in 1983. Lists of drivers or repair workers who frequented the industrial area near the church. Records of anyone living nearby, especially Frank Devlin, who had once lived in Pennsauken. One officer asked, "So Boone saw two men. Do we have any suspects who operated as a pair?" Nora turned back to the board. Keller, shorter, quicker steps. Devlin, taller, slightly stooped back. "Every detail Boone gave matches these two," Nora said. "And McKinney." "McKinney isn't ruled out," Nora replied, "but Boone's height description is very clear. Only Keller and Devlin match perfectly." Just as from the ground up when the meeting ended, Nora stayed behind alone, staring at the 1983 Camden map. Where Haley walked, forensics had shown. Where her body lay, the earth had revealed. Who touched her? DNA had spoken. Who saw them? Boone had come back. For 40 years the Haley Carmichael case had been buried among countless cold files, but now, it was no longer cold. Nora had the shape of the killers, and for the first time that shape had two people. What Nora now knew clearly was Haley didn't leave Camden on her own. Someone, or several people, put her in a vehicle. Boone's memory of the heavy car door slamming still echoed in Nora's mind like an unsolved signal, but for 40 years, no one had followed the trail of that vehicle. No report of a suspicious car, no license plate description, no witness who saw it clearly, until Nora found something neither the 1983 police nor later cold case units had ever noticed. In the dusty archives of the now abandoned St. Marin Church, there was a tattered cardboard box containing old photo albums of community events. Most were Christmas services, Easter celebrations, or religious gatherings. But at the back of one album, Nora discovered a few loose photos, unlabeled, held only by rusty metal clips. The pictures were faded, taken under weak yellow light, but the background was unmistakable, the corner near where Haley was last seen, in 1983. "What do we have here?" Nora muttered, carefully lifting the photos. One figure, in the wrong place in the first photograph. The church group is setting up decorations, but at the edge of the frame, across the street, a man stands alone, leaning slightly toward the tree-lined stretch, exactly the area where Haley was last seen minutes before she vanished. Nora took the photo to the enhancement unit. 2024 technology can reveal details the human eye can't. After processing, the image was still blurry, but clear enough to make out, "I reg to tall height, wondered in full cap, wondered in full cap." The description instantly reminded Nora of one person, Frank Devlin, the man who appeared on the parking lot camera at 9:45 p.m. "Could be him," the text said. "Could be," Nora replied, but her heart was pounding. If Devlin was already near where Haley walked before the disappearance, then being spotted by Boone later was no longer coincidence. However, the second photograph was the one that silenced the entire lab. The van that appeared in the photo, before the two figures were seen in the second shot, behind the man, was a light-colored compact utility van, the kind used for maintenance and hauling tools. Part of the license plate was obscured by tree shadows, but the vehicle's shape was distinctive, a compact utility van common for churches, schools and community facilities, in the early 1980s. Nora asked the lab, "Can you pull the image?" "Low pixel count," the specialist said, "but we'll try." They spent 2 days boosting resolution, restoring edges, cross-referencing old vehicle catalogs. Finally, they confirmed, Ford Courier van, 1979, 1981 model, thin metal maintenance panels on the sides. Nora accessed the New Jersey DMV database and requested every Ford Courier registered in 1983 in the Camden, Pennsauken area. There were 39 total. She filtered by Monders light color, fitted with maintenance racks, Monders registered to a religious or community organization. The list dropped to 6. Now filter by addresses near St. Marin Church or under church management, Nora ordered. Result: 1 vehicle only. registered to Franklin Doss, occupation maintenance worker, St. Maren Church. Nora read the name over and over. Franklin Doss, a name never on any suspect list. Franklin Doss had never been mentioned in the 1983 file. No witness named him. No officer checked him. No report referenced him. But now, he worked directly behind where Haley vanished. He had a vehicle matching the photo. He had unrestricted nighttime access between Camden and Pennsauken for church maintenance. He fit the profile of someone intimately familiar with the terrain, exactly what the forensic timeline predicted. When Nora pulled later DMV records on the van, she found something odd. The vehicle vanished from all records starting in 1984. No sale reported, no accident, no title transfer, no plate surrender. It disappeared from the system, as if it had never existed. No one just gets rid of a van without paperwork, Nora said. An officer replied, unless they don't want it traced. Nora closed her eyes and pictured it. Monders Haley attacked. Loaded into the small van, accomplice helping move the body. Dumped in Pennsauken. Once things cooled down, the van was eliminated to erase evidence. Every thread led to the only person who owned that van, Franklin Doss. But one more detail gave Nora chills stronger than anything else in the file. Doss worked at the church until the end of 1983, right after Haley was killed, then quit with no clear reason. A man walks away from his job immediately after a horrific crime on the road he frequented. That can't be random. Doss's timeline, lost in the records. Nora ordered every remaining trace of Doss pulled, tax filings, in employment records, in address registrations, old vehicle inspections, and church staff lists. The result was a void. No tax return in 1984, no fixed address, no medical records, no driver's license after 1985. He just vanished, an officer said. No, Nora answered. He deliberately vanished. Everything looked orchestrated. Van disappears. Job disappears. Community presence disappears. This wasn't the behavior of someone indifferent to paperwork. This was the behavior of someone hiding a crime. Doss primary suspect. After the briefing, Nora stood at the timeline board and drew a thick red line from Haley Carmichael, Camden St. Maren Church Franklin Doss Ford Courier, Van Pennsauken, disposal site. Every forensic point, every statement, every new piece of data converged on this one name. Keller and Devlin remained suspects, but they were now secondary. The person with the vehicle, the person with the opportunity, the person who vanished after the crime, the person in the photo at the exact spot Haley passed. Franklin Doss. Nora wrote his name in red marker, the first official primary suspect in the Haley Carmichael case in 40 years. Doss primary suspect. Next to it she added a short note, sharp as an order, find him, by any means. When Franklin Doss officially became the focus of the investigation, Nora knew one thing. If any trace of him still existed after 40 years, it could only be at St. Maren Church, the midpoint between Camden and Pennsauken, and the exact spot Boone saw two figures melt into the darkness. The church had been abandoned for nearly 3 decades, sealed by the city as a collapse risk, but Nora secured a special search warrant. That morning, the forensics team and investigators entered the old grounds. The rotten wooden doors were forced open, the rusty hinges groaning, revealing a dark, cold nave covered in dust and cobwebs. The stale smell of mold seeped through every crack, mixing with the hollow echo of footsteps. Nora stood in the main hall, her flashlight sweeping over the shaky pulpit, the forgotten altar, rows of decaying pews. She whispered, Haley was here, I'm certain of it. The basement, things never written into any report. St. Maren Church had a large basement once used for community events, yet the 1983 files contained no record of any search there. Perhaps because police back then believed Haley was snatched directly off the street, or because no one suspected a place of worship. Nora shone her light down the wooden stairs to the lower level. Each step creaked, as if stepping on decades of rot. The basement was so dark, the flashlight beams seemed swallowed, revealing only the rough edges of old brick walls. On the dirt floor, dust lay inches thick, but in the farthest corner, Nora noticed something strange. The dust there was thinner, as if recently disturbed. "Start in that corner," Nora ordered. As the forensics team moved in, they found a rotted sheet of plywood leaning against the wall. Behind it was a small makeshift alcove. Deep inside lay a canvas bag, caked in dried mud but not completely destroyed. They pulled the bag out. Nora stood right beside it, heart pounding. Inside were an old length of nylon cord, twist pattern identical to the Newton Creek 2004 evidence, 2 torn fabric scraps, matching the material once stuck to Haley's arm bones, the small roofing hammer with unusual dents on the metal head, a piece of wood with paint, apparently once part of a tool handle. The entire team fell silent. Every item pointed to one thing: this was where Haley had been restrained before being taken away. "Forms match," the forensic specialist exclaimed, holding the cord under UV light. 3-strand twist, nylon cotton blend, wear pattern identical to the cord used on the victim's wrists. Nora narrowed her eyes at the evidence. "We have a temporary holding cell, a place of restraint, a place where violence occurred. DNA, a third person emerges." For the first time the cord was rushed for DNA sampling, but the surprise wasn't on the cord, it was on the small hammer. Despite nearly 40 years of age, the wooden handle had preserved dead skin cells in the cracks, and the lab extracted a mixed DNA profile from 2 men. First individual, Franklin Doss, 82% match, enough for presence confirmation. Second individual, Ronald Pierce, pastor of St. Marin Church in 1983. The briefing room held its breath as the results were read. Nora leaned on the table with both hands. "Ronald Pierce," she said, voice dropping, "the church pastor, the man with the keys, the man who could enter any room, the man no one ever considered." A young officer beside her whispered, "Ma'am, Pierce is still alive. Moved to Maine in 1998. Nora stared at the whiteboard. Keller and Devlin were the 2 figures. Doss had the van, but Pierce had the location. "We thought this was 2 people, Nora said quietly, "but maybe the truth is 3. The church journal, an unintended confession. While the forensics team swept the basement, Nora went upstairs to the pastor's office. Beside a decayed wooden desk was a rusted locked drawer. An officer pried it open, and inside was an old yellowed notebook. "Pastor's journal," the officer said. Nora put on gloves and opened the early pages. Most were notes about weddings, baptisms, community events, but when she turned to the last entry for August 1983, her spine went cold. August 17, 1983, 11:10 p.m. "No one must see me here tonight." Nora read it aloud, freezing the room. Next page, Frank brought the van right up to the basement door, told him to keep quiet. "Cannot let the parishioners hear." The following page held only a few jagged, frantic words. "She is unconscious." No choice left, no names, no details, but forensics, and the timeline filled the blanks. "My God," an officer whispered. "They hid her in the church." Nora closed her eyes. She wasn't religious, but the blatant sacrilege of this crime made it hard to breathe. "Pierce wrote this," Nora said, "and Doss brought the van, and Keller or Devlin carried Haley in. Caught marks, matching the Pennsauken bones in the basement." The forensics team kept scanning the dirt floor. One called out, "Found a cutting tool." They held up a small blade with a broken handle. The edge was rusted and coated in 2 oxidized patches. When analyzed, the blade showed scoring and nicks consistent with the faint saw-like marks on Haley's shin bones, previously concluded to be from sliding across a hard surface post-mortem. Susan Price reported directly to Nora, "This blade made contact with the victim's body. Not the murder weapon, but used to process the body before disposal." Nora froze. "They cut something off her, not dismemberment," Susan replied, "but signs of removing something from the wrists or ankles, possibly cutting binding cord when moving the body. In other words, they processed the body here before taking it to Pennsauken." 2 primary suspects emerge. Doss and Pierce forensics never lies. DNA on hammer. Doss plus Pierce cord matches Newton Creek evidence. Church journal entries on the night Haley vanished. Paint from hammer handle matches sample on Pennsauken fabric. Blade scoring matches bone marks. Every forensic arrow, one by one, pointed to the same two men at once. Franklin Doss, the van, the transport, the route. Ronald Pierce, the holding location, the church keys. The undeniable coincidence. Nora stood before the reconstructed timeline board, gripping her marker tightly. We saw the figures. We saw the van. Now we see where it happened. She drew a heavy red line under two names. Doss, primary suspect. Pierce, primary suspect. The room fell silent. Then Nora spoke, voice hard as steel. We have two perpetrators. We know where they took Haley. And now, we have direct evidence. She closed the file. Start digging into both their pasts. This is no longer suspicion. 40 years of dirt, time and forgetting, just peeled away. St. Maron Church, once a holy place, had become a warehouse for crime, and the two names tied to it were no longer hidden in darkness. Not every case has a single moment when the truth finally crystallizes into a clear shape, but for the Haley Carmichael case, Nora knew that moment had arrived, when the cord matched the Newton Creek find, when Doss and Pastor Pierce's DNA appeared together in the church basement, when Boone confirmed two figures, and when forensics proved the body was moved. For 40 years, this case had been a chain of broken events, but now, the scattered pieces were pulling together like iron filings under a magnet. It was time to reconstruct the crime timeline, for the first time complete and logical. Around 9 p.m., two suspects appear near Haley's workplace, based on the digitized church photos, and the AI-enhanced 1983 security footage. Nora concluded, Frank Devlin, was present near the tree-lined stretch Haley walked through. Height, build, and slightly stooped posture match the photo description. The forensic timeline shows Devlin could have left his radio repair shop to be there exactly when Haley got off work. Alongside Devlin, Boone described two figures in the alley. The second, by height and gait, matches Dion Keller. Although Keller has no direct visual evidence, his presence in Camden at that hour, and his false statement about going to buy cigarettes place him in the secondary suspect circle as a possible accomplice in the initial approach. Nora marked the timeline start 9 o'clock, 9:15 p.m. Haley leaves Soundwave Records. Devlin plus Keller in the vicinity of her route home. 9:20 p.m. A/B deduction on the tree-lined stretch based on Ramirez's statement. Even if the time isn't exact, forensics places Haley passing the trees around 9:18, 9:23 p.m. From Boone, 9 even running footsteps, the sound of metal hitting the ground, consistent with the fatal blow, and a car door closing. This shows Haley was not attacked in Pennsauken or inside the church. She was attacked right in the Camden neighborhood, near the trees. Forensic skull evidence, fracture at the rear. Haley never saw the blow coming. Nora wrote on the timeline, around 9:20 p.m., Haley struck unexpectedly from behind with a blunt object, likely the church roofing hammer. Two suspects involved. One striking, one grabbing holding, matching details, mud marks on the concrete. Mide Boone, seeing someone's feet lifted off the ground. Two male DNA profiles on the evidence. 9:25, 9:35 p.m. Haley taken to St. Maron Church. This is the segment the 1983 police completely missed. Using Boone's description of the direction of movement toward the church, Nora reconstructed the route, might have 5 minutes on foot from the trees to the church, or 2 minutes in the small van Doss's vehicle. Old photos show Doss's Ford Courier van already in the area. Haley walked. Moreover, Pastor Pierce's journal entry, Frank brought the van right up to the basement door. Dated August 17, 1983. This proves, Doss drove, Nos Devlin, Keller escorted Haley. Nosta Church was used as the first holding location. Nora wrote, 9:25, 9:35 p.m. Haley taken into the basement of St. Maron Church. Doss plus Pierce had the space prepared. The basement is where the matching forensic cord was found. Doss plus Pierce DNA appeared together on the hammer. Fabric scraps identical to the Pennsauken finds were discovered, and Pierce's journal confirms she is unconscious. The timeline was no longer speculation, It was becoming the backbone of the case. 9:40, 10:30 p.m. Assault, binding and body processing. Forensic wrist bone marks show binding occurred while Haley was still alive or immediately after death. This means Haley was still alive when bound inside the church, or died from the head injury shortly after. Shin bone abrasion, body dragged across a hard surface. Blade marks used to cut cord or something on Haley's body. Forensics concluded Haley struck hard around 9:20 p.m., unconscious within 1-2 minutes, dead between 9:25-9:35 p.m. Body dragged slid inside the church between 9:30-10 p.m. Nora broke this segment down. 9:40-10:30 p.m. Haley bound with the confirmed forensic cord. Initial body processing in the basement, cutting bindings, repositioning, wiping blood. Body loaded into Doss's Ford Courier van. Pastor Pierce's note, no choice left. Nora needed no further explanation. 10:30-11 p.m. Body moved to Pennsauken, using 1983 road maps. The route from St. Maren Church to the Pennsauken disposal site took 12-14 minutes driving at night. Forensic soil on Haley's bones showed industrial metal oxide unique to Pennsauken, absent in Camden, old industrial carpet fibers, matching a small van, fine sand from the erosion zone near the burial site, all pointing to body loaded into the van driven straight to Pennsauken, shallow burial. Nora completed the timeline segment. 10:30-11 p.m. Doss's van leaves Camden. Pierce may have been along or in the vehicle. Body buried shallowly in the Pennsauken wasteland, later exposed by the 2004 landslide. No one found Haley in 1983 because the body was deep in an area no one frequented. The van disappeared from records the following year. The church was never searched, and police at the time believed Haley had run away. For the first time, a complete timeline on the large whiteboard. Nora wrote, Crime Timeline. August 17, 1983, 9 o'clock, 9:15 p.m. Haley leaves work. Devlin plus Keller appear near the tree-lined stretch. 9:20 p.m. Haley struck from behind. Fatal blow. 2 suspects overpower and drag her toward the church. 9:35 p.m. Doss drives van to basement door. Haley taken into St. Maren Church basement. Pierce present. 10:30 p.m. Haley bound. Initial body processing. Body dragged slid. Matches bone forensics. 10:30-11 p.m. Body loaded into Doss's van. Driven to Pennsauken. Shallow burial in wasteland. 11 p.m. Onward, perpetrators clean up. Van disappears from records the following year. Nora stepped back and looked at the full timeline, a structure the Camden Police Department had never possessed before. Forensics witness statement locates DNA vehicle Journal Times. For the first time, every piece fit together with terrifying perfection. Haley, Nora whispered, "We finally know what happened to you." She turned to the investigation team, voice sharp as a blade. "Now we don't just know how they killed her. We know when, where, with what, and who was with whom. Only one step remained: turn the timeline into evidence, and bring the perpetrators into the light, after 40 years in the dark." Once the crime timeline for the night of August 17, 1983, was fully reconstructed, Nora understood the Haley Carmichael case had entered its final phase, arrest and justice. But to achieve that, she had to convince both prosecutors and a future jury that fragments gathered over 40 years were not coincidence, but an unbreakable chain of evidence. The two names at the eye of the storm were Franklin Doss and Pastor Ronald Pierce. One had the vehicle, one had the location. Both had DNA in the St. Maren Church basement, where Haley was held, and her body processed. It was time to close the circle. Operation to arrest Franklin Doss. Doss had vanished from New Jersey public records after 1984. No tax filings, no driver's license, no registered address. The man had disappeared from the map of the United States. But Nora had one thin lead: an expired 1993 passport application under the name Franklin J. Doss, last address in Camden, 100% social security number match. From there the team traced backward through old church records, abandoned utility bills, work permits, statements from former neighbors near the church, and finally followed a faint trail to Berks County, Pennsylvania, a small farm that hired undocumented seasonal labor. The task force moved fast. They arrived on a gray, foggy morning, mist blanketing the fields. Farm work logs showed an elderly laborer with no papers, known only as Frank. No one knew his full name. He had worked silently since 2005, an officer asked the farm owner. Is he a quiet guy? Reply, no one knows where he came from. He sleeps in the old shed, doesn't talk to anyone. When police entered the shed, they found a thin man with a long beard, gray-white hair, deep-set eyes, but the stooped shoulders and gait told Nora instantly, Franklin Doss. Franklin Doss, you are under arrest for first-degree murder and concealment of Haley Carmichael's body, committed in 1983. He stood motionless for several seconds, then said a sentence that sent a chill through Nora. Took you longer than I expected. Doss did not resist, did not deny, did not confess, just silence. Arrest of Pastor Ronald Pierce. Pierce had moved to a small town in Maine in 1998, living quietly in a wooden house on the edge of the forest. No one knew who he really was. He preached to a few families, surviving on a pension and small congregational donations. When the task force arrived on a snowy afternoon, Pierce was tending the garden behind the house. Nora approached Mr. Ronald Pierce. He turned, eyes showing no fear, almost unnervingly calm. I figured you'd find me eventually, he said. You are under arrest for first-degree murder, accomplice to kidnapping, and aiding in the concealment of Haley Carmichael's body, in 1983. A faint smile crossed his face. We'll see what the court thinks, he said. No admission, no protest, no request for a lawyer on the spot. He simply allowed himself to be cuffed and walked to the police car, back straight, eerily composed. At the prosecutor's office, turning fragments into a complete case, Camden County Prosecutor Linda Tremaine was the first to receive Nora's full timeline report. She read the file for nearly 3 hours without looking up. When Nora finished presenting the DNA, the cord, the roofing hammer, the church journal, and Boone's statement, the prosecutor said, "This is no longer a cold case. This is an organized murder, and we can prove it." Nora asked, "Will the court accept decades-old evidence?" Tremaine replied, "If modern forensics proves the chain of custody, if the physical items were properly preserved, and if witness statements are reinforced by the timeline, the court will have to accept it." Over the next 3 months, they prepared 34 forensic reports, 67 physical exhibits, 14 witness statements, 4 DNA experts, 2 1983 scene reconstruction specialists. Every fragment became a blade aimed straight at Doss and Pierce. The trial, a battle of evidence and time. The trial began in July 2025, a case that drew national media attention. For the people of Camden, it was the chance to finally learn the truth after 4 decades. For Haley's family, it was a moment both painful and liberating. The prosecution presents the evidence one by one. The items were laid before the jury. DNA: Doss's DNA on the roofing hammer, Pierce's DNA on the hammer handle, mixed DNA from 2 different men on the binding cord and fabric scraps. Forensic timeline: skull trauma matching the hammer's dent pattern, binding marks matching the cord found in the church basement, cut marks on the bones matching the blade from the basement. Physical evidence: the binding cord, the roofing hammer, the pensock and fabric scraps, the pastor's journal with entries on the night Haley vanished. Witness testimony: Boone saw 2 figures, heard metal strike the ground, heard a car door slam. Suspect movements: Doss appeared where Haley walked. 1983 photo: Pierce was inside the church that night. Keller slammed possible accomplices, but focus on the 2 organizers. The prosecution closed with a statement that left the courtroom in absolute silence. Haley Carmichael died in the hands of men she never knew, and those men, these 2 defendants, left their traces on every piece of her bone. Defense attacks: Chain of custody. The defense knew they couldn't break the DNA, so they attacked the 2004 misfiling of evidence, the integrity of items after decades, natural degradation of cord and hammer, Boone's imperfect memory. They argued, it's easy to tell a story 40 years later, but not easy to prove it happened exactly that way. Nora felt her chest tighten. She knew the prosecution had to crush this argument. The court accepts modernized evidence. On day 12, forensic specialist Susan Price took the stand. She explained, DNA was extracted directly from the items, not from old storage bags. The DNA profiles could not be created by the environment. Forensic bone matches were completely independent of storage conditions. Finally, the judge ruled, the court admits all forensic evidence, including aged items, under modern scientific standards. The courtroom exhaled. Defense counsel bowed their heads. Convictions: Franklin Doss. The prosecution proved, Doss drove the van that removed Haley from Camden. Doss's DNA on the murder weapon. Doss participated in body disposal. Doss vanished from records immediately after the crime. Verdict: guilty of first-degree murder plus concealment of a corpse. Sentence: life without parole. Pastor Ronald Pierce. The prosecution proved, Pierce prepared the basement as a holding site. Pierce's DNA on the murder weapon. Journal entry: Frank brought the van to the basement door. She is unconscious. Pierce cleaned the scene after the crime. The jury barely deliberated, guilty of first-degree murder plus kidnapping plus evidence tampering. Sentence: life without parole. Pierce stood motionless as the verdict was read. No trembling, no protest, no plea for mercy. But as he was led out, he turned to Nora. His eyes no longer held the pious look from old photos, only the emptiness of a man who had lived nearly half his life on top of his crime. He said only one sentence, "You don't know the whole story." Nora didn't answer. She watched him disappear down the courthouse hallway, like the shadow of the old church he once ruled, where the truth had been locked away for 40 years. The courtroom falls silent. Justice finally spoken aloud. Haley's family hugged and cried. They were old now, hair gray, faces etched by time, but the pain was still 1983. Haley's younger sister whispered to Nora, "Thank you for finding it. Both the truth and my sister." Nora simply replied, "No." Haley spoke. "Her bones told us everything." She looked up at the gray Camden sky through the courthouse window. The wind blew through the rows of trees, where Haley had walked that fateful night, as if blowing away 4 decades of dust to reveal the final truth. No crime stays buried forever when forensics, time and memory stand on the side of justice. Doss in handcuffs. Pierce led away. Haley Carmichael's story turned a new page, one of delayed but complete justice. And Nora knew this case would become the greatest investigative lesson for the entire unit. Never underestimate small details, old evidence, or statements once thought unimportant. Those very things had led them to this courtroom today, where 2 men who believed they had buried the truth forever were finally dug up by their own past. The verdict for Ronald Pierce and Franklin Doss echoed through the courtroom, not only closing the 40-year justice journey for Haley Carmichael's family, it also triggered a chain reaction spreading across New Jersey's criminal justice system, then to other states. Right after the trial, the Camden County Prosecutor's Office held an emergency meeting with the state attorney general, issuing an unprecedented conclusion in the state's cold case history. SISTRY. The investigative mistakes of 1983 prolonged a family's pain for 4 decades, and we must ensure this never happens again. The ripple effects began from there. State legislators held a special hearing, using the Haley case analysis to identify systemic weaknesses. 1. Witness testimony dismissed. Boone, the homeless witness, was completely ignored in 1983. Nora testified before the committee. We lost 40 years simply because one person was deemed unreliable. 2. St. Maren Church never searched. No warrant on the night of August 17, 1983. Despite its location right in the suspect movement route. 3. Evidence misfiled in 2004. The cord, fabric scraps, and button were never assigned to the Haley Carmichael case code, leaving them unexamined for nearly 20 years. These oversights led the Justice Agency to decide, Act, the New Jersey Cold Case Reform Act, 2025, which requires all evidence from the 1970 90 SB digitized with barcode tracking within 3 years. Any witness statement deemed unstable must be recorded and permanently stored. Every location within 600 meters of the last seen site must be mandatorily searched. DNA retesting every 10 years for unsolved missing persons. The Haley case became the reform template. The biggest explosion from the case was the 2004 storage error, the one that let the Newton Creek evidence sleep for nearly 2 decades. Right after the trial, the New Jersey Forensics Lab issued an order SIG. No cold case evidence shall be stored without digital case coding. The new procedure includes 360-degree photos of every item upon receipt, preliminary DNA testing even on degraded items, automatic database updates, mandatory alerts if evidence doesn't match original case files. A young forensics technician said in a press conference, "The Haley case shows us no evidence is meaningless, only evidence that hasn't been understood yet." Marin Church was searched. Nora and the forensics team recovered not only Haley's evidence, but also found an old blood-stained handkerchief, completely unrelated to her. The DNA sample was sent for analysis. Results: cystin, female, age 17-21, cystin not in Evers, not in 1895 victim file. A major review was launched, auditing 1980-1990 evidence, storage, retesting 213 U-analysis samples, tracing DNA found in the church. In a press conference, the Attorney General Director said, "Haley Carmichael may not be the only victim taken to St. Marin Church. We will not leave anyone else in the dark." The case's aftershocks now extended beyond KMD. After Haley's bone DNA was traced through GEDmatch Pro, dozens of universities, research institutes, and forensics training programs began incorporating the Haley case into their curricula. Princeton University created a dedicated module reconstructing a 40-year-old homicide through multi-source genealogy. The FBI added the case to training materials on genetic genealogy and forensic timeline integration. They emphasized 4 factors that made this case exceptional. 1. Forensic timeline plus genealogy equals tracking suspects in pairs, not just one person, but at least 2, identified via mixed DNA. 2. Old photos plus AI enhancement. A seemingly useless photo frame became the key to identifying Doss's van. 3. Old evidence, but modern forensics. The Cord and Hammer Bridge, 1983 to 2025. 4. Religious journal key to motive and opportunity. Sister Tirzak. Purse accidentally left an incomplete confession, something only modern forensics could fill in. In a national conference, a forensics expert said, "No case used all 4 data lines: DNA, data reconstruction, physical evidence, and witness testimony, to create a complete picture like the Haley Carmichael case." Haley's name is now attached to the industry's new standards. KMD looks back at itself in the KMDN community. The case sparked a deep self-reflection. Why was Haley assumed to have run off with a boyfriend? Why was the church never searched? Why was the homeless witness ignored? These questions were discussed in schools, churches, city council meetings. KMD mayor declared in Haley's memorial ceremony, "We didn't just find justice for one girl. We found the truth about an era when the city failed to protect the most vulnerable." She laid a wreath at the tree-lined stretch where Haley was last seen. Haley's family stood silent, hands held tight. It wasn't Doss or Pierce who left a mark on New Jersey's justice history. It was Haley Carmichael who did. A 19-year-old girl walking home on a familiar street. A disappearance misunderstood, forgotten, buried. A cold file for 40 years. But through technology, forensics, and investigator Nora Klein's tenacity, Haley's story became the driving force behind cold case procedure reforms, the new standard for evidence storage, a pioneering case study in multi-level forensic genealogy, the reason for reopening dozens of other missing persons cases, and a reminder that every victim, no matter how dusted by time, deserves to be heard and protected. Haley Carmichael wasn't just found, she brought other victims out of the darkness with her. Her legacy is the truth and justice for those the world once forgot. Finally, as the late afternoon light fell on Camden's tree-lined street, Nora stood at the spot where Haley once vanished. No more shadows, no more open questions, only one truth shining through. When a story is told in full, it can change an entire system, and the Haley Carmichael case did just that. Looking back at the Haley Carmichael case, through the lens of America today, the most chilling part is not just the crime committed by Doss and Pastor Pierce, but how the system failed to protect a 19-year-old girl and prolonged her family's suffering for 40 years. Haley didn't disappear in some remote forest or distant desert. She was attacked on a familiar street, close to her workplace, in a community everyone assumed was safe. Boone's testimony, the homeless man who heard the metal strike the ground and saw two figures dragging something toward the church, was dismissed simply because he was poor and lived on society's margins. The cord that matched the one used to bind Haley was misfiled in 2004 because of a single wrong code. St. Maron Church, a place regarded as sacred, became a temporary prison, where the pastor wrote in his journal, "No one must see me here tonight." These details remind Americans today of three very specific truths. First, never dismiss the voices of the vulnerable, the homeless, the working poor, young women. Boone was telling the truth. Society just didn't want to listen. Second, "I'm too busy," or "it happened too long ago," is never an acceptable excuse when it comes to justice. If New Jersey hadn't reformed its cold case procedures and embraced DNA genealogy, Haley would forever remain just a name under missing. Third, never idealize any institution or individual to the point of skipping oversight and transparency. Even a pastor can abuse power and use sacred space to hide evil. In everyday American life, Haley's lesson is this: listen, ask questions, trust science and transparency, because sometimes all it takes is one person willing to re-examine a file, re-interview a witness, or speak up when something feels wrong to change an entire family's fate. If you want to keep following investigative journeys as relentless as the Haley Carmichael case, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Thank you for joining us, and see you in the next video, where we continue shining light on truths that were once buried.